Peters since we were started. So it's wonderful to welcome you here. There are a group of us that have been kind of committed to making sure that the 50 plus of Life Learn, or whatever we call starts again. So we have Senior Lunch and Learn. No, 50 plus 50. Want to gather more people. 50s might not think they're old, but they're getting there. So I have a couple announcements to make, and I'd love to remember all the people on the committee, but I'd leave somebody out, so I'm not even going to go there. We have our next meeting. First of all, I hope you enjoyed the lunch. It was catered by Jerry's, so and put together by a lot of volunteers. So we could use some help in setting up. The only complaint we've had from someone that will remain nameless is that I did not bring him some red wine that I promised. In the future, who knows? So please. I'm with him. So in the future, who knows what we're going to do about that. So I'm glad we're doing this again, and I love the good turnout, and I'm sure it's because of our speaker coming up. But our next gathering is going to be on November 9th. So if y'all could put that on your calendars, of course it'll be in the keys and all that good stuff. Yes?
I've confirmed the person.
Oh, good. And we're going to have, what the speaker is going to be, why don't you?
Elizabeth, I think it's Rosario. You said it right. And it's 100 things to do in Tallahassee before you die.
So we thought that would be good to talk about things you can do in Tallahassee. I'm a native and actually a third generation Tallahassean, depending on how you count. So there are more things to discover here than I ever thought possible. So that's going to be our agenda next time. And the others, we're going to meet 3 more times, but I've talked enough. I would like to introduce our speaker. Fortunately, he gave me a bio, although I've known this man for a long time. I think I could muddle through a little bit, but he is a 7th generation, beats me. Floridian. His ancestral grandfather came to Florida in 1784. 101 years later, in 1885, his great-grandfather arrived in Tallahassee, and family members have lived here since. After graduating from FSU with a BS in Public Administration, he immediately went into the Army, serving with the 2nd Armored Division in occupied Germany. Following this, he returned to Tallahassee and became employed with the newly formed Florida Division of Corrections. He was promptly sent to Florida State Prison at Rayford. Fortunately, they let him out. He, being newly married, found his mother-in-law missing her daughter. Upon hearing of a job opening with the clerk of circuit court, she suggested that Dave might want to apply for the job. 41 years later, after seeing many changes in the Florida court system, he retired as the Leon County Clerk of Circuit and County Courts, ended his career with a bang, the 2000 presidential election that put Tallahassee in the world spotlight. And I think most of us who are here can remember that time. He has a passion for both Tallahassee and Florida history, and he's here to share that with us today. He's also a 3-time president of the Historical.
Yeah, but we got our lifetime president right here, Brother Bob, and he's going to be taping this thing.
So welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Woo. Well, I feel sort of like the 500-pound baby canary. You know what he said? Shut up! Okay, I hope to wake you all up to Leon County, Tallahassee history. Now, whether you know it or not, you're trotting on ground that has so much history, you would not possibly believe it. We've got evidence of human occupation here going back over 11,000 years. That was found down the Osceola River down there near Lamont. They found a mastodon tusk down there that had etchings on it that only humans could put on there. But this has been occupied by Indians of different things. Seminoles, they are the most newest newcomers you could possibly have to Florida. The original Indians in here, in this particular area, were the Appalachian Indians. There were probably 6 or 8 other groups of the Calusas down there on Miami, but the Spanish, when they came in here in the 1500s, early 1500s, they found that the Indians in here, the Appalachians, they thought they were giants. And I think the reason was because they grew food, they had fish, they had all the game they could hunt. They were healthy as they could be. They had longbows that could shoot through that Spanish armor like crazy from 100 yards. And we had 2 Spanish explorers that came in this area. Narvaez, who came up early and hugged the coastline, wound up at St. Mark's. And the going was so tough, he took his whole crew out on barges of the Gulf. Very few survived. Next was the most prominent Spanish explorer ever, and that was Hernando de Soto. Did you know that Tallahassee houses the only site in the United States where he has been identified as having encamped? He encamped within sight of the capital for 5 months, from 1539 to early 1540. And that site it's a shame, but it has not been advertised that much. At the time it was found, it made national news and international news. But I doubt if many of you know where it is, or those of you that know where it is, raise your hand. Okay, you see what I mean? Well, after that, the diseases and everything that the Spanish brought were flowing into them, and the Spanish were the most cruel people in the world. Of course, the Indians were just about as bad to them, but they'd run into a village, and they'd grab the chief and hold him hostage. If he didn't cooperate, they'd cut off his nose, they'd cut off his ears, they might burn him at the stake, they might turn their war dogs on him to chew him alive. They wanted 3 things. They wanted food, they wanted bearers for their stuff, and they wanted their women for their pleasure. And that's what they got when they went to each of those villages. So they weren't popular with the Indians. But the original tribes that were here and had been here 1,000 years, you remember out Lake Jackson Mounds? That was their earlier home up there. And the Mound people, South Georgian, that sort of thing. We had the Mound people at Lake Jackson. So by raids, there was a governor in 100 years later when they started splitting Spanish missions from St. Augustine all the way up to Tallahassee and around. Only Spanish mission ever revived is out here at Mission San Luis. If you haven't been there, you have really missed it. It's a great place to go and visit. They have a gift shop. They have a tremendously nice auditorium and meeting halls. But the village they have built and the fort they have reconstructed is great. If you haven't been, I really think you'd enjoy going. However, there was a governor up in the Carolinas that came, and what was left of the Appalachians that were there, he slaughtered them and took the rest of them prisoner back to South Carolina. And virtually all those original Indian tribes were gone. Then 100 years later, when Georgia, Alabama started filling up with the new settlers, the Indians were driven down into Florida. They were creeks and what have you. And those people mainly became known as the Seminoles, AKA the runaways. And that's where our Seminole Indians came from. Now, we also had some of those groups became the Miccosukee Indians, and they were at Lake Miccosukee. And that's when Andrew Jackson was ordered by the president to come into Florida and to get rid of those, because they were raiding South Alabama and South Georgia, then coming back into Spanish Florida where they could not be touched. And so they had just, those folks had just about enough, and the president says, Andrew, get your Tennessee volunteers and get your butts on down there to Tallahassee and clean this mess up. And he did in 1818. 6 years later, Tallahassee became Tallahassee. Now, how did that happen? It happened because we had, at that time, 2 Floridas. It was Spanish all that time, but by treaties with the wars in Europe and everything, from 1763 to 1783, it became under British rule. And gather my little brain here together for a second. And they formed into 2 Floridas. The seat of government in one place was Pensacola. The second seat of government was in East Florida at St. Augustine. So when we became a state in 1821, we had legislators. It was called the Legislative Council. There were 13 men composed of 6 in one place and 13 in another. They first met in Pensacola. Well, that meant that the folks in St. Augustine had to go around to that meeting, and it took them almost a month by water. They had no charts or anything to get to Pensacola. They wound up in Mobile and had to backtrack to there. At that point, their president of the group, or chairman of the group, died of yellow fever, and one of the others, one of their clerks also, I think, passed away. The next year it was held in St. Augustine, and they had virtually the same thing. People drowned going by water around, and they said, what the heck? We have got to have a central meeting place so we don't have to do all this traveling. Well, they appointed 2 people. They appointed Dr. William Simmons, who was a member of the council that lived in St. Augustine, and they appointed John Lee Williams, who was a lawyer in Pensacola, who was also a member of the council, as their representatives to find a location for the capital. 200 years ago, last Tuesday week, 200 years ago, last Tuesday, Dr. Simmons set out on horseback from St. Augustine, Florida. He had a couple of weeks worth of food with him. He stayed in Indian villages along the way, and there was nothing but Indian trails coming up here. Nothing but Indian trails. And he made it through. He and John Lee Williams were to meet in St. Mark's, because that was the only habitable European port around, and then go from there. And so he made it through. And then it was even later that John Lee Williams came in from Pensacola, because this is hurricane season, and all kind of things happened to that poor fella on his way over. And so it took him over a month to get from Pensacola to St. Mark's. Now, how fast would it take you to drive there now? But those were the conditions people lived with back in those days. And remember, it was only 6 years since Andrew Jackson had come into here. Tallahassee, Miccosukee. That was his goal. And when he, by the way, when Jackson got here, he came. One thing that really got him here, and what the president got him here, there was a massacre of a barge full of soldiers and wives and children that were going up from Appalachia, and they had Spanish permission to do so, up the Apalachicola River to the fort up there in Alabama, and they were attacked and massacred by Indians. Well, guess what they found over here at Lake Miccosukee? A scalp pole with human scalps, some of them fresh. That didn't necessarily prove that they were the same people. However, as they chased those Seminoles at one place down the road here, they were headed south down toward the Suwannee River. They came upon, had just had a battle there. A voice came out of the brush out there, and it was a woman. She stood up and yelled for help. She was one of the ladies. She was probably the sole survivor from that massacre on the Apalachicola River. And she had been captured by the Miccosukees, and they were taking her down the road with her. But that was the situation back in those days. And gee whiz. So once Simmons got here and once the Williams got here, they had a couple of plantations over there around Quincy. Now, Quincy was not there then, but that was just sort of an adjunct to St. Mark's. And one of those landholders became their guide. He took them over here. They met with the Indian chief. Now, that Indian chief was supposed to have skedaddled some time before under the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, but he was slow moving. But he showed them a good time and that sort of thing. And they saw the Cascades. Williams loved it. Dr. Simmons, though, had made up his mind, more or less, for the capital being another location, because he's found a place rather close to St. Augustine that he just liked. It was where the Santa Fe and it flows into the Suwannee River, and the name of the little community is now known by the name of Branford. So if you were at the Capitol today and he had his way, you'd be sitting in Branford, Florida, down there below Live Oak. But at any rate, Williams held out for it. They kept on going south, but finally the old doctor said, "Damnation, I am tired of this stuff. I'll go for Tallahassee." So they came back, founded Tallahassee. Now, one of the earliest settlers that came in here was in April, I think, of the 14th of 1824. Anybody ever know Larry Levy? Larry Levy was a lawyer here in town. Raise your hand if you knew Larry. Okay. His son's Lauren. Lauren's here. And Larry and I grew up in school together from second grade on up. And Larry was a direct descendant of the first settler to arrive in Tallahassee. Yes,
I did not know that.
he certainly was. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing. But things began to move, and people began to come in. But travel was, why'd they come here? In a wilderness? I mean, why? Because this was the richest area in Florida, the richest soil. Up in the other areas in Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, that sort of thing, they didn't have fertilizers and stuff in those days, and their soil wore out. And they were looking for a new land. Cotton, sugar cane, rice, and other things like that, but mainly cotton. And this became the Cotton Kingdom of Florida. By 1860, Leon County alone grew more cotton than any county in Georgia or Alabama, except for several counties in Georgia and just a couple in Alabama. They shipped out in 1860 through St. Mark's 6 million pounds of cotton that year from this small populated area. And we were the Cotton Kingdom. We were Cotton Kingdom much more than we were a capital. And that railroad that went down there to St. Mark's started out with an engine on it. But the soil down there was so boggy and stuff, and they couldn't put up a base on that thing enough. And one day the old engine just toppled over into a hill, and they replaced them with mules. So it became mule drawn, and the rails were wooden rails, and they had iron straps on top of those rails, and that was the railroad going down there. It took them a while to get there, but it got things down there. But we had old tram road too. I'll tell you that story on that. That ran from Chairs down that way. And we got so much, gosh, I said so much history you wouldn't believe it. But cotton was king. And let's see, I believe in, here's us, we had, I wrote this down somewhere and I'll find it in a second. We had, in 1860, we had 125 what they call planters. In other words, more or less plantations in Leon County, ranging from the north, which is the richest, down to south. And you know what the definition of a planter is? Any idea? Wasn't the acreage that he had, it was the number of slaves that he owned. If you owned over 20 slaves, you were a planter. If you had less than 20 slaves or no slaves and you were a farmer, you were a yeoman farmer. Y-E-O-M-A-N. So there were 125 planters, that means big plantations, and we had 194 yeoman farmers in 1860. But let's go back to where we started on developing Tallahassee. Travel was extremely perilous. Now, we had cheerleaders. We had a delegate, not an elected official. We had a delegate to Congress, and he cheered on what we had here in Leon County, and that brought a lot of big name people that you've heard of. Epps and all those other folks, they came down here. Mariama's kinfolks, the Bradfords, came in from Enfield, North Carolina with their brother-in-law, Governor John Branch. And Mariama fortunately inherited a lot of documents from one of the Epps sisters who'd married her cousin, Richard Bradford. We call him Uncle Richard and Aunt Martha. And they left this stuff, and she has a lot of those papers, of which I'm going to show some of these, or one of them in a few minutes. But it was really rough getting in here. It was strictly Indian trails, and to give you one example here, when Robert Butler moved here, Robert Butler is the guy that did all the surveying. He established the monument down here in Cascade Park that defines all of the land measurement in both Florida and, believe it, Alabama. Robert Butler's trip down here a year later in 1825 was very perilous. He brought his wife, his 7 children, and a cumbersome caravan of family carriages, slaves, household furnishings, provisions, farm implements, as well as mules and oxen, plus his highly prized, fine-blooded Tennessee horses. And it took them 42 days to come from Nashville to Tallahassee. 42 days. And it was they had Indian perils along the way. So they would sometimes risk their lives coming here, but they did. And that brings us up to where I really want to start today. And there's a young lady I want to talk with you about that. Let me look out here in the hall and see if she's still here. Oh, okay. Oops, hold on. Well, I guess she couldn't make it. But her name was Betsy. And frankly, I do not know her last name. They arrived here in early 1824. And I got a few notes on her. Let's see here. Oh, well, from her, she left a diary. Now, ladies, reach under your chairs there for a second. See what you might find. I hope it's your seat belt, because buckle your seat belts. You're gonna take a real ride, because this is truly Betsy's entries from Betsy's diary that has been handed down over the years. And from her diary, I was able to determine that she and her family were from Virginia, that she lived a quarter of a mile from the council house. That's where the first legislative session met, and that was down below where the current Capitol is, probably near the corner of Gaines Street and Monroe, but don't know exactly. Her father apparently opened a store here, or was wanting to open a store here. She was amazingly well educated, born in Virginia. They were probably, well-to-do folks, and they were coming here to make some money. But everything that was built in those days, they didn't have lumber shipped in or anything. Log cabins. I mean, everything was log cabins. It might be furnished with the finest of their china and rugs and tapestries, but they were in a log cabin. And Tallahassee still had a couple of log cabins in the 1890s. One of them was not too far down from the Capitol. Another one was on Jefferson Street, just below the FSU campus. Probably where let's see, Gamma Phi Beta sorority house, I think, was in that area in there. It was a 2-story log cabin. And but she was the oldest of 5 children, Betsy. And I said, I've looked through records. I did not find anything, but if we go to the graveyard, I think what we found in this diary, what I found in this diary, I think we can find. Here is, brings tears to my eyes. It's really good. But I'll get over this in a second. Okay, here we go. Tallahassee settlement, November 30th, 1824. Give me a minute to get my composure back, because I've had a lot going. Okay. Mother thinks it would be a wise thing to keep a journal out here in the wilderness. She thinks, let me get my eyes straight. She thinks these days will be something to look back upon in the years to come. And then she said, it would be practice for me in my composition. Since she is too busy to give me more than a few minutes each day for my lesson, so we're beginning to get used to this wild country. Today a dear little fawn came right up to our cabin door. When I would bring it in for the little ones, thanks, okay. But when I would bring it in for the little ones to see, it scampered away into the wilderness in great haste. Father and the boys came home laden with birds and wild fowl. Brother has taught me how to shoot. I can bring down a turkey as well as any man can. This is her actual diary. I do not like the Indians. They frighten me. But Father says that the Tallahassees are a noble tribe and will make friends unless we should do something to make them otherwise. It's the runaway Creeks that call themselves the Seminoles that may give us trouble. The men have fortified the council house as best as they can against attack. Now, the next day, that was November 30, here she goes on the next day. Wipe my eyes off and I'll be fine. A new family came in yesterday. I was down by the tavern. Bad place. When they came in. That was every town, one of the first things that went up was a tavern. And did you know that people used to take a whiskey break at 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon? I think Dr. Pepper picked up on that later on, they came in, there were 3 little children, a chubby little boy with 2 shy little girls about 8 and 10. They seemed so glad to have reached the settlement. The mother spoke to me, asked if there was a church here. Now, churches in those days were essential. Any community that was formed, the church was the heart of it. They were the law and order. If somebody got out of line, church members would have a little meeting, and they would send a little committee out there to see Joe and straighten him out. If he didn't straighten out, they would ostracize him until he finally left town. But so they asked if there was a church here. She said they came from South Carolina and her husband is going to start a store. And they bought boxes of things, for in it were 3 wagons. I think she's going to be the greatest lady of the settlement. Mr. Hutchison's brother, for their name is Hutchison, the oldest girl told me, a young lawyer is with him. I like his face. Okay, Mrs. Hutchison seemed real glad when I told her we came from Virginia and had 4 little ones and the children could play with them. People are coming in every day now, but Father doesn't want me to go down to the tavern to see them. I suspect some of the men are a little rough. I just pretend that I don't hear them when they address me, and Mother says that's all a lady can do. Next letter, the next day, December 2. We had our first real scare from Indians yesterday. Yeah. A man came riding wildly into the settlement calling that Indians were on the warpath and were coming in this direction. The men hustled all of us women and children into the council house and left old Uncle Willis Hobbs and the 2 McClendon boys to look after us. This is an interesting letter. Interesting in her diary. The 2 boys almost cried. They wanted to go with the men. And like the way John Hutchison, the young lawyer, went about helping to get off. He smiled at me as he passed the council house. And keeping that, they would all, and calling back that they would all be back in a short while, and I can be sure that he's very brave. You can see something going on there. It was lonesome here after the men left, even with the women and children and Uncle Willis and the 2 boys. They would not let us peep out the windows or the doors. Old Mrs. Hobbs talked a good deal about this being nothing compared to the days when she and Uncle Willis follow the trail of Daniel Boone through the wilderness in Kentucky. Mother and Miss Hutchison seemed like they liked each other very well. They talked together about the old homes in Virginia and South Carolina. They said it makes them feel as if they had known each other always. The men came back about dark. Maybe we were not glad to see them. I don't understand that one. But Mrs. Davis, who had fretted all day about her husband, fainted when she saw her husband. But most of the women who had lived in the wilderness all of their lives and had sat around smoking their pipes and talking about other days and places that had been rougher than this settlement here, just got up as cool as they could be and went on about their business and to their men, laughing and talking. Now, Mother and Mrs. Hutchison looked pale and tired, but Mother said it would never do to let backwoods women appear to be braver than she, or how frightened she got. She is a brave little woman, for never once has she given herself away, and the women of the settlement looked up to her. None of the men around were hurt, just as a few slight wounds from Indian arrows. There had been a little battle, a little ambush fighting, and Father said there's just been a little band of Creeks on their way to join some of their tribe further south. John Hutchison insisted upon carrying Rob, that's one of the little boys, who was fast asleep. I think it's very kind of him. And he told me so when he said good night. And I told him so when he said good night. I hope he didn't think me bold. All right, okay, hold on. December 3, everything is quiet again. No more scares from the Indians. Mother says it's time to think about Christmas. In Virginia, they had frost and maybe a little snow by this time. I was going to make Father and Brother gifts of little bags of rabbit skins for their shot, for their guns. But I do not know what to make for Mother. I saw an old Indian squaw down by the council house yesterday with a dear little pine needle basket that she was trying to trade for a red kerchief around a man's neck. Believe I will make one for Mother. We'll gather the needles this afternoon, but it will not be a surprise like Father's. We can't hide anything from Mother in Perin. Can we, Mother dear? So, okay. Her next letter was the 10th, a few days later. Almost a week has gone by since I wrote my journal, but I have been so busy getting ready for Christmas that I have not had time to write. Mother says we must make Christmas just as much like the Christmas in Virginia as we can. The Hutchisons are going to take Christmas dinner with us, and we're going to have a party and tree at their house that night. It is all very exciting. I can hardly wait, and I'll bet she couldn't. Mother is making me a pretty dress out of one of hers that she brought us that was in Grandma's old haircloth trunk. I believe I'm going to like Florida very much. I do too. And after all, John Hutchison walked me home from the store yesterday. He thinks it not safe for me to walk out here alone, just a quarter of a mile from the council house by myself. I wonder if all nice young gentlemen are as particular as he is. All right.
Well, did they get married?
We'll find out. We'll find out. 10 days later, December 20th was her next entry. I shall never forget yesterday if I live to be 100. Mother and Father decided to go over to see old Mrs. Hobbs, who was sick. Mother did not like the idea of leaving us alone, but Father said we'd be safe. Anyhow, could not Betsy, that's me, that's how I found out who it was. Could not Betsy, that's me, shoot anything that could come prowling around? Mother waved to us as she rode away in front of Father on the old gray mare and called to us, "Do not leave the house for anything until we return." I was glad for Mother to have the day free, though poor old Mrs. Hobbs was sick. I went about my housework quickly and so I could work on my Christmas gifts. Just 5 days before Christmas. It was a beautiful day, balmy and warm, warmer outside than in, and the children cried to go out to their playhouse under the shineberry tree, but I would not let them go out the door. When dinner was on, I decided to run across the clearing to the pine grove to replenish my supply of needles, which had run pretty low. Baby was asleep, and I had Rob and Molly and Kate stand in the doorway and watch me. To count, to measure the time. Baby was asleep. Oh, I'm rereading that. To measure the time it would take for me to come and go. So, snatching up a small basket, I ran swiftly out down the path across the road to the grove. The ground was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles. I gathered them with all speed possible, carrying them in my basket. I kept my face turned toward the house. There was no undergrowth at that point, so I could distinctly see the little fingers in the doorway. When I gathered the last handful, I rose to signal the children that I was ready to start back. When I froze in my tracks with horror. It was queer, is it not, that one little object thrown into a tranquil scene can so change it. At the side of the house, farthest away and approaching from the thicket behind, came an Indian, gliding stealthily toward the house. I knew instantly that he had not seen me, and my first impulse was to hide. Then I remembered the children, the door unbarred, wide open, no gun. There was only one thing to draw his attention, and that was to run. He would be between me and the house. I could not possibly reach it, but I could run like a deer, and he would follow. It could have taken no more than a second to have thought this out, but it seemed hours, like I should stood there watching him silently and swiftly approaching the house. At last, breaking the spell, I yelled as loud as I could and ran toward the road leading into the settlement. I looked back once. He was following. Fear gave wings to my feet. I seemed to bound over the ground, but I knew only too well my limitations. I saw, like swiftly moving pictures, all the terrible acts of Indian massacre I had heard of during the year past. I kept saying over and over, God, save me, please. Please save me. Give me a minute. My chest began to ache. Then, actually, I stopped breathing. But I heard the light crunch of moccasined feet behind me. I had been, in a way, conscious all the time of defeat. But when I realized absolutely my helplessness, I became numb all over. My feet dragged, I stumbled and fell. When I raised my head, I saw John Hutchison running toward me. His face was pale and his eyes filled with horror. "Betsy," he called, "are you hurt?" I tried to raise myself, but I was too spent. So I shook my head and turned it so I could see what had become of the Indian. He was nowhere in sight, but running down the road came the children, their faces as wild as John's. They had seen the whole thing, and Rob pointed with his chubby little finger, crying, "He's gone that way, Betsy. We just counted to 200. Didn't mean to stun you back there, Bill. Okay, so we hurried back to the house and barred the door, for we didn't know how many Indians might be lurking around, but none disturbed us. John said he had heard as he had heard there was a band of Creeks that had passed within 10 miles of us the day before, and suggested that our visitor was probably a stray one of those. After the children had become less excited, John told us how when Mother and Father passed their house and told them had left them alone, that we had been left alone, and he had seen Mother's anxiety, he had walked over to stay with us until they returned. As he came inside of the house, he saw me running, closely pursued by the Indian. John shouted as I fell, and the Indians, seeing him, darted off to the left like a rocket. He had tried to scold me for leaving the house, but he could not. He could only thank God that he had reached us in time. Then I remembered the pine needles and spoke to them, of them. John smiled and started toward the door. With his hand on the latch, he turned to me and looked straight in the eye and said, "I'm going after your pine needles, Betsy. Be sure to bar the door until I get back. I will not be gone long, for I think you will need someone to look after you." He was gone like a flash, and my face was still burning when he returned with a basket filled to the brim with fragrant brown needles. After that, John seemed to take everything for granted. I wonder if all gentlemen propose in that manner. I had not said a word. Okay. Last entry. There was nothing after that till December 22nd. Mother thinks I improved in my composition. She says my entry yesterday shows more feeling. She laughingly suggested that I show it to John when he comes to speak to Father tonight. I wonder if I dare. So that's the last page of the diary. This is a true diary, and can you imagine? And you can see why these pages have been handed down. They're priceless, and they tell you an awful lot about what Tallahassee was like in those early days. So, how's our time going?
We need to wrap it up.
Okay, fine. We'll open it to questions. How about that? Yes, ma'am.
Has the diary ever been published?
I think there's been an attempt to in the past. Yeah. It'd
be a night, because that's the whole. Did you read the whole diary, or just
that this is all there is.
That would be a great illustrated book.
It would make a wonderful presentation as a play or something.
Yeah.
But this is all there is to it, just these few pages. And I was up most of the night. I hunt and peck, and I have to print real big. So that's it. But you know, we got, hey, if any further questions at the moment? But I'll stick around. Yes, ma'am.
Where is the diary now, Dave?
I have, it's secreted away.
Okay, but you got it.
I have the pages, yeah.
I think it's fascinating.
Ma'am?
I think it's fascinating.
Well, it is. But we got tons of history. You know, good golly, you know Fort Braden out here? That was a Seminole Indian War fort. It was named for Virginia Braden, whose husband had a plantation near Lake Hall. And later on, that family moved down south. Have you ever heard of the town of Bradenton? Okay. Same people. He moved from Tallahassee down to the Bradenton area. But this town is full of stuff like that. So enjoyed being here. Hope you enjoyed the talk.